to 11 million job vacancies. And so we're very mindful of that. Unfortunately, our immigration system is not well designed to address the need for labor. It is our hope that reform actually is legislated to address that issue.
Right. You know, and I always picture some of the agreements that sadly we were not able to get passed. One passed in the Senate when Senator Grassley was actually the Republican leader of the committee, but it is some combination of border resources on the southern, and I would add northern borders, as well as the increase in the caps of these type of workers, as well as green card citizenship issues, especially for our dreamers and some of those. And I add into that group Afghans. As you know, more than 75,000 Afghans sought refuge in our country. I'd say about half of them have literal letters from our chief of mission and our military vouching for them. They stood by our soldiers, our military, VFW, American Legion. All believe we cannot leave these people in limbo, and many of our Republican colleagues that are supportive of our efforts focus on the fact that we can do more vetting this way. These are people who are in our country. Senator Wicker and Moran and, of course, Senator Graham, the ranking member of this committee, have been part of our efforts on the Afghan refugee and have signed their name on this bill, and we're working with other senators as we speak. And our bipartisan legislation that I know you're aware of requires applicants to go through vetting that is just as rigorous as the vetting they would have gone through if they came as refugees. A standard that 8 former Republican administration national security officials called the gold standard of vetting. And so we have worked with your department and DOD on this. How would the vetting provisions included in the Afghan Adjustment Act help to ensure that Afghan evacuees are fully and rigorously vetted?
Senator, we're very appreciative of that act, and we do hope it is promulgated. In Operation Allies Welcome, our effort to bring Afghan nationals who stood by us in combat safely to the United States, we undertook a rigorous screening and vetting protocol. And we did that before they arrived to the fullest extent possible. This act really institutionalizes that process and also provides stability for those Afghan nationals who are here in the United States and provides them with a critical path forward.
Very good. I'm going to end here with a series of questions on fentanyl. I know you've been asked this by my colleagues, but I want to look at solutions. We've lost, like everyone else here, many people in our states to this scourge. Senator Portman and I passed the STOP Act to require that international mail include advanced electronic data that CBP can use to stop fentanyl, and at least use that, because as you know, there's issues with the actual mail. Could you talk about what difference that has made? I'm going to just combine these questions so you can. Secondly, in 2021, there were more than 100,000 drug overdoses in the U.S., and Senator Capano and I have urged the department to prioritize investigations into fentanyl trafficking on the dark web, which is another part of the problem. It's the mail, it's the dark web, and then also this week I introduced a bill with Senator Scott to allow military veterans to be trained as investigators through the DHS Heroes Corps program to conduct investigations into fentanyl trafficking online, another piece of the cyber part of this. Could you talk about the cyber piece of this as well as the mail piece of it? Because I know you've gotten at other issues with our colleagues.
Senator, your questions go to the significance of the challenge that we face, because it is not just through the land ports of entry. It is certainly not just by land, but it is by mail. The dark web, the internet pose marketplace challenges for the illegal trafficking of these incredibly dangerous, fatal narcotics. The STOP Act is a critical tool to allow us to pre-screen, to be aware of any anomalies, information that will assist us in the interdiction of contraband coming in through our mail system. It's been of tremendous utility to U.S. Customs and Border Protection. With respect to fentanyl trafficking, the dark web is a marketplace not only for fentanyl, but for other heinous crimes. We're seeing such an increase, for example, in online child sexual exploitation. Here again, our incredible special agents of Homeland Security investigations, along with our special agents of the United States Secret Service, are doing extraordinary work in an all-of-administration effort. We are very appreciative of your HEROES Act and the use of military veterans, capable individuals who've served our country so nobly, to work with us in battling the online proliferation of narcotics and other contraband and other illegal acts.
All right, very good. Well, thank you for your service, and you'll happy to hear my next question. Would you like to be part of our 10-minute recess that the committee will now take?
I think I will be.
Okay, very good. The committee will now take a 10-minute recess. Thank you.
will resume. I thank Senator Klobuchar for helping. We have one more roll call vote on the floor, so members may be coming and going. But at this point, recognize Senator Cruz.
Good morning, Secretary Mayorkas.
Good morning.
Is there a crisis at our southern border?
Senator, there is a very significant...
That's a yes or no question.
There's a very significant...
Is there a crisis?
Senator, there's a very significant challenge.
I think your microphone is not on.
There is a very significant challenge that we are facing.
Yes or no,
at the
is
southern
there a
border.
crisis?
I believe I've addressed that question.
So you're refusing to answer?
Senator, there is a very significant challenge, and
will you
are
answer if there's a crisis?
Therefore, we are dedicating the resources.
Okay, so you're refusing to answer. Well, Secretary Mayorkas, I'll tell you someone who is willing to answer, which is your and President Biden's chief of the Border Patrol in a sworn deposition in July of 2022 when asked, would you agree, Chief Ortiz, that the southern border is currently in crisis? Answer, yes. Notice none of those wiggle words, none of that equivocation. One word, one syllable, yes. Are you willing to speak with the same clarity as Chief Ortiz? Is there a crisis at our southern border, yes or no?
Senator, I'm very proud to work alongside.
So you refuse to answer. Let me ask you the next question. Has the crisis at our southern border made Americans less safe, yes or no?
Senator, we are dedicated to the safety
Has the crisis made Americans less safe? I don't want a discourse. It's a yes or no question.
Senator, we have a challenge of
You refuse to answer the question. Mr. Secretary, let me show you how someone doing his job answers a question in a straightforward manner. Chief Ortiz, is the crisis that is currently ongoing at the southern border making the border less safe for Americans and aliens alike? Answer, yes. One word, one syllable, 3 letters. That's how someone answers a question and does their job. You're being a politician misleading the American people. Let me give you a chance again. Will you show the same integrity Chief Ortiz shows? Is the crisis at the southern border making Americans less safe? Yes or no?
Senator, we have 260,000.
You refuse to answer the question. Let's move on.
And security of the
Next question, Mr. Mayorkas. Has the crisis made aliens less safe? Yes or no?
Senator, we are seeking.
So you won't answer that question either. It's a yes or no. Has it made aliens less safe?
Senator, smugglers are exploiting.
Has the crisis made aliens, less safe? Are you willing to answer it?
Senator, the smuggling organizations.
Okay, you're filibustering again. Let me ask you this question. How many migrants have died under President Biden?
Senator, your phrasing of the question is actually quite misleading.
How many migrants died in 2022?
Approaching our southern border?
Yes.
Precisely why we are seeking to exclude the smuggling.
Do you know the answer? Do you know how many died?
I do not.
You do not. Of course you don't. I know how many died. 853.
That is
853. And by the way, here are the numbers that have died every year. You go back to 1998, you see it's consistently between 300 and 400, 300, 400, 300, 400. Suddenly, 2021, what happens? You get in office, and that red line are dead bodies. I've been on the Rio Grande, and I've seen dead bodies floating there who've drowned because of your refusal to do your job. You don't even know how many have died. What do you say to the Texas farmers and ranchers who find pregnant ladies dead on their property, who find toddlers dead on their property? What do you say to them?
I say that is why precisely we are taking it to the smuggling organizations.
But you are not. That is simply not true.
Number two, it is why we are dedicated.
Let me read from the Wall Street Journal. The Wall Street Journal 2 weeks ago ran an article entitled, "It's like a graveyard. Record numbers of migrants are dying at the border." The story begins with this chilling line, quote, Eagle Pass, Texas. Local officials keep a refrigerated truck to hold the bodies of migrants who drown in the currents of the Rio Grande while trying to cross the border into the U.S. Mr. Chairman, I ask unanimous consent that this article be entered into the record. Let me ask you a different question. How many children have been sexually assaulted by human traffickers under the Biden administration?
Senator, this is precisely why We instituted
I don't
on
want a lecture. It's a question. How many children have been sexually assaulted by human traffickers under your administration?
Senator, this is exactly why on January 5th, we announced
Again,
the parole
do you know how
program.
many? Do you know how many children have been sexually assaulted?
This is why we
Okay, you're going to refuse to answer that question as well. Let's move on. It's obvious you've been instructed to stonewall, so I'm not going to let you. You don't get to stonewall and filibuster. Now, one of my Democratic colleagues before said the Democrat talking point, quote, this problem didn't start under Biden. Look, I get if you're a partisan spinner, you got to figure out something to say about the absolute catastrophe that has played out under the Biden administration. True or false, Secretary Mayorkas, 2020 was the lowest rate of illegal immigration in 45 years. Is that true or false?
It is certainly the lowest level of immigration in many, many years. And what was it
Okay, fine.
in 2020? What was it, Senator, in 2020 that impacted the entire world, including the United States?
Okay, so your testimony is the reason we had the lowest rate was COVID. It had nothing to do with building the wall, nothing to do with ending catch and release, nothing to do with Remain in Mexico. With all respect, Mr. Secretary, that answer is laughable. And in fact, if you look at illegal immigration, let's look at CBP encounters. You can see 500,000, 500,000, it drops to the lowest level, and boom, what happens? You show up. And that red line is you. That red line is Joe Biden. And you're claiming nothing happened. Oh, gosh, this was here before us. No, you made the decision to allow this to happen. Let me ask you, we now have over 5.5 million people who've entered this country illegally under Joe Biden. How many murderers have you released into America?
Senator, I'm not aware of any murderer whom we've
So you don't know?
Senator, let me say something.
Do you know?
If you take a look at...
No, you don't get to give a speech. Do you know how many murderers you've released?
I'm just trying to answer your question,
How many rapists
Senator.
have you released?
Senator, I'm trying
Do you
to
know?
answer your question.
You can answer, I know or I don't know.
Senator, any individual who poses a public safety threat...
How many child
is
molesters have you
detained
released?
and removed into the United States, from the United States.
Oh, so your testimony under oath, subject to perjury, is that you have not released any murderers, rapists, or child molesters among the 5.5 million. Is that your testimony?
Mr. Chairman, may I have the opportunity
No,
to
you may not. You may answer my question.
You're not
Is
allowing...
that your testimony, yes or no?
Senator, you're not allowing me to answer your question.
I am allowing you to answer. I'm not allowing you to filibuster.
If you take a look at the pace of immigration in 2018 to 2019...
You're refusing to answer. Let's move on. Let's move on to gotaways. Gotaways are the people that get away that you know about. Now, what happened under your administration? Gotaways consistently down at this low line. Boom, you get in. And they go from below 180,000 to 600,000. Now, I'll tell you this about a gotaway. You don't know among those 600,000 a year, you have no idea how many are murderers, correct?
That is precisely why the
Correct?
number of gotaways...
Do you know how many of those are murderers?
That is precisely
So you
why...
refuse to answer the question. You know how many are rapists? Do you know how many are rapists? This is a question. You're a lawyer. You know how to answer questions. Of the 600,000, do you know how many of them were rapists?
Senator, this is why we
So again, the answer is no. Let me ask you this. Do you know how many of them are terrorists? And I don't want to, Senator, here's my lecture on this. Do you know how many of the 600,000 gotaways were terrorists? Yes or no?
Senator, we are focused on the
You
safety
refuse
and
to answer
security.
that as well. What's the result of massive gotaways? Well, one of the results is drug overdoses. And we now have, last year, over 100,000 overdoses who died, the majority from Chinese fentanyl streaming across the border. Now, you told Senator Cornyn you care, but look what has happened under your policy. When you open up the border to the worst illegal immigration in our nation's history, people die. You claim you care. Mr. Secretary, that is a lie. You know, some months ago, Karine Jean-Pierre stood up at a White House briefing and said, people are not just walking across the border. Was she telling the truth?
Senator, you are
Was she telling the
so
truth?
profoundly disrespecting...
Was she telling
my
the truth?
22 years
Okay,
of government service.
you get to answer questions. You don't
Senator,
get to give speeches.
Senator, I served as a federal prosecutor
All right,
for
you're
12
refusing
years.
to answer. If you look at, she was lying, and she was not lying on her own. She was lying on behalf of the President of the United States. Now, the photograph of people walking. She was lying on behalf of the President of the United States. This is a photograph from just one day along the Rio Grande of hundreds of thousands of people walking across the border. You have allowed this to happen. The photograph that was before, what are these wristbands?
I don't know what they are.
You
Senator.
don't know what they are. Mr. Secretary, you have just testified to the American people you're incompetent at your job, because I've been to the southern border, and if you go to the southern border, along the southern border, you see thousands of these wristbands because the illegal immigrants wear them. The drug cartels, every color corresponds to how many thousands of dollars they owe the cartels. You have turned these cartels into multi-billion-dollar criminal organizations, and these are modern-day leg irons because these are children being sold into sex slavery, and you don't even know what they are. That is astonishing. Mr. Secretary, how many children have been sold into sex slavery under your administration?
Senator, we are taking it to the cartels.
How many children have been sold into sex slavery? Do you know how many children have been sold into sex slavery?
To an unprecedented degree.
Mr. Secretary, I want to say to you right now,
It is precisely-
your behavior is disgraceful, and the deaths, the children assaulted, the children raped, they are at your feet, and if you had integrity, you would resign. And I will tell you, the men and women of the Border Patrol, they've never had a political leader undermine them. They despise you, Mr. Secretary, because you're willing to let children be raped to follow political orders. This is a crisis, it's a disgrace, and you won't even admit this human tragedy is a crisis.
Claiming 1 minute chairman time, Mr. Secretary, would you like to respond to any of those questions?
What the senator said was revolting. I'm not going to address it.
Your refusal to do your job is revolting.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I actually think it's disrespectful, the treatment that we've just seen the Secretary undergo. I think it's respectful to suggest or imply that that the root causes of our broken immigration system are so simple that they can be answered in 2.5 seconds or less, that the solutions necessary to improve our immigration system for the needs of today and the future could be delivered in 2.5 seconds or less. So let me, for the moment, continue some questions on the subject matters that our Republican colleagues keep bringing up over and over and over again, and we'll stay on fentanyl for a second. Correct me if I'm wrong, Mr. Secretary, but I think Senator Booker earlier mentioned that in 2021, it's been found that U.S. citizens accounted for more than 86% of convicted fentanyl drug traffickers. Does that sound about right to you?
Senator, as I mentioned to Senator Booker, I'm not familiar with that statistic. I'm certainly aware of the fact that American citizens are participating in the trafficking of illegal narcotics
The
across
reporting
the
in the
border.
cities that I've seen do document that the vast majority of those bringing fentanyl into the country are United States citizens, not the migrants that our colleagues on the other side of the aisle are implying. Also, that nearly 99% of the consumers who are paying for illicit opioids, so we can look at both ends of this, right? Who's driving the demand, not just who may be responsible for the supply. Statistic, again, from federal agencies, 0.02% of the people arrested by Border Patrol for crossing the border illegally possessed fentanyl at the time.
More than 90% of the fentanyl brought into this country is brought in through the ports of entry.
Right.
I cannot overstate the viciousness and cruelty of the smuggling organizations. It is
Exactly.
precisely why we are building safe, orderly, and lawful pathways for people to come to the United States if they are eligible, and cutting out the smuggling organizations.
And that's the point I'm trying to get to, Mr. Secretary. I want to sort of level set, sort of reality check the conversation, because the challenge is a serious one and should be approached with seriousness and maturity. So now that we've caught our breath from the prior exchange, I want to afford you an opportunity to speak into the administration's approach, the significance of a whole of government approach to the problem, not just whole of federal government, but any partnerships, real or potential, that you think can be value added here. I know in the state of California, for example, state resources are being committed to augment additional screening equipment and other technologies that can help in this cause in a productive manner.
So two different parts, Senator, and I appreciate the opportunity. The administration's approach to the migration challenge, which is quite serious, and it is one that is not exclusive to the United States, but is gripping the entire region. There are approximately 2.5 million Venezuelans in Colombia now. There is an unprecedented movement of people throughout the hemisphere. Our approach is to cut out the smugglers, who are indeed vicious and cruel, and to build safe, lawful, and orderly paths for people to arrive in the United States. And on January 5th, we announced a parole program for Cubans, Haitians, Nicaraguans, and Venezuelans, that they could apply for entry into the United States in a safe and orderly way, and we would deliver consequences if they arrive irregularly in between our ports of entry at the southern border. We have seen a 95% drop in the number of encounters of those four nationalities in between our ports of entry. People will take advantage of a safe, lawful, and orderly path if it is presented to them, and we are cutting out the smuggling organizations precisely for the reasons that Senator Cruz mentioned. With respect to fentanyl, we are bringing the fight to the cartels in an unprecedented way. We have surged resources, most recently in Operation Blue Lotus, which is already demonstrating significant results. We are using our personnel, our extraordinary personnel. We are using technology. We are using everything that we can bring to bear to fight the scourge of fentanyl and other synthetic opioids. We are also requesting of Congress additional resources so that we can enhance that fight. We need to work together to address a challenge that precedes this administration, and we need to work on it together. It is something that is killing far too many Americans.
I agree. Thank you. And as you know, there's many of the ideas, proposals that you and the White House have suggested that I agree with and support, and several that have been proposed or suggested that I don't agree with, and we're having those constructive, mature conversations. I want to make sure to touch base on a couple of other important issues, including the Shelter and Services Program. I was pleased to lead the effort last year to ensure there was adequate funding for the program, which was formerly known as the Emergency Food and Shelter Program that allows reimbursements for non-governmental organizations and local entities that provide shelter, transportation, and other services to migrants at the border. Again, security and humanity in the process. It was previously housed under FEMA. Now the program is under CBP. So I just raised it to acknowledge this transition and formally request regular updates on the implementation of the new program to ensure that the entities that rely on these funds to play that supportive role that they have been can continue to access the funds that we make available.
I appreciate your support of that program. The funding is critically needed. We have funded the Emergency Food and Shelter Program with $350 million of the $800 million. And of course, we are standing up the SSP, it's known by its acronym. And once that is stood up, of course, we will be funding that with the balance of the $800 million and distributing it to cities for their care of individuals here.
Next topic and next issue, something that we've had a couple conversations about. In 2022, the Army struggled to meet its recruiting goal of enlisting 60,000 soldiers. It only enlisted 45,000 that year. As our armed forces collectively look for ways to incentivize enlistment, one way, not the only way, but one way that has worked throughout our nation's history is to ask immigrants who enlist, or to ensure that immigrants who enlist are able to become citizens quickly as specified in the Immigration and Nationality Act. I understand that since July, the USCIS and the Department of Defense began work on a memorandum of agreement to formalize their partnership and to coordinate services for members of the military to naturalize early in their military careers. When do you expect that MOU to be finalized, and what tangible steps can we take to improve the naturalization rates of military service members?
Senator, thank you very much for that. It is remarkable that individuals have been willing to serve in our armed forces before they have become citizens. We've made tremendous progress with the Department of Defense to allow individuals to naturalize who are serving in our armed forces at an earlier stage, and we're going to be moving quickly on that now. We had a very significant development yesterday on that.
Thank you. Look forward to working with you on that as well. And in my time remaining, I just wanted to acknowledge earlier in the hearing, you brought up FEMA, actually in your opening statement, with the appropriate attention to Mississippi, where the tornadoes and their impact are dominating the national news right now. But I also feel a responsibility to remind my colleagues and you and the country about the California communities who continue to experience an onslaught of devastating atmospheric rivers and the devastation in the wake of recent storms. Entire communities have been flooded. Farms are underwater. Thousands of families being evacuated from their homes, and many who will either not be able to return to work anytime soon or return to their home anytime soon. And I want to specifically call attention to the community of Pájaro, which is a small, low-income, predominantly farm worker community that has for decades been overlooked by FEMA, frankly, agencies at all levels of government, but specifically the Trump-era individual assistance regulation under FEMA is exacerbating the hardship. California struggled to meet FEMA thresholds for disaster assistance because the regulation established a new factor called the state fiscal capacity and resource availability to be considered when FEMA evaluates the need for individual assistance. So this isn't the public assistance for communities, cities, municipalities, et cetera, to rebuild. We're talking individual assistance here. The rule has resulted in significant disparities and inequities. It's left out disaster survivors like those in Grizzly Flats, suffered from wildfires just a couple of years ago. Without the support they need, communities like this continue to wait in limbo as California waits to tally up more and more damage than other states just to get the same level of federal assistance. So I wanted to put that on your radar. I'm sure we'll continue to talk about this in HISGAC in the coming weeks, but we have to fix these clear inequities in federal guidelines and regulations. Thank you, Mr. Secretary. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
I look forward to following up with you, Senator.
Thanks, Senator Padilla. Senator Hawley.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, Mr. Secretary. Thank you for being here. Let me start with what I hope is a simple question. Do we need to have more or fewer people coming to our southern border?
Senator, we are working on diminishing the number of people whom we encounter at our southern border because of the challenge it presents. We're trying to build lawful, safe, and orderly pathways to accomplish that.
Okay, fewer. So we need to have fewer, which means we need to roll back incentives to come. So I would have thought that would have been the answer. Let's talk about what you're doing, though. In January of this year, you rolled out a new phone app called CBP One, an app for a cell phone. I've got a picture of it behind me here. This phone app allows, and I'm going to quote from your own fact sheet, it allows, and I quote, non-citizens without appropriate documents for admission to schedule an appointment to come to the border. They can now go on their phone and schedule a time to come to the border and then be admitted. And you identified 7 separate border points of entry where they could come. 5 of them in Texas, 2 of them in California, 1 in Arizona. It's like a concierge service for illegal immigrants. My question is, you didn't think the border crisis was bad enough that now we're going to have an app that allows illegals to schedule their appointments and come and be admitted to this country?
Senator, you're mischaracterizing the use of the application. Let me explain it to you. We are currently enforcing the public health order of Title 42, and I know you're very familiar with it. There is a process for individuals who claim an exception to the Title 42 expulsion authority because of an acute medical condition.
Well, let's talk about this app.
If I may finish, an urgent humanitarian reason. So instead of them coming in between the ports of entry to claim that urgent medical condition, that extraordinarily acute humanitarian cause. We allow a limited number to arrive at our ports of entry and seek the emergency relief that they need.
Schedule, you allow them, let's be particular about what
And I
you
should
do.
say that the CBP One app was not unveiled for the first time on January 5th of this year.
Oh, no, but you changed it. You made it available on January 5th to the illegals themselves. You don't have to be a lawyer to use it. You don't have to be a member of a non-governmental organization. Anybody can download the app and use it on their phone. And for the first time, you allowed them to schedule appointments. Now, let's talk about what actually happens when they come to the border. It's interesting. You characterized this when you rolled it out as an application for applying for asylum. But nowhere on the app do you actually require the illegal migrants to apply for asylum or to claim asylum or anything about asylum. And in fact, when they then get to the border, you don't ask them questions, you don't do interviews, you just release them. Here's the Texas Monthly, not a notable conservative outlet, who reports, and I quote, "At no point does the app ask users, are you seeking asylum? Those arriving for the CBP One appointments are given no interviews, asked no questions about vulnerabilities that they may or may not have listed in the app or about why they're coming to the United States. They're simply released into the country," end quote. So rather than building a wall, Mr. Secretary, you have built Ticketmaster for illegal immigrants.
You are, Senator, you are conflating programs. Let me explain
Well,
to
just
you.
respond to this. Is it true that they are given no interviews, asked no questions, and simply released into the country?
Let me explain to you what we announced on January 5th.
No, I want you to explain to me what's happening. I know what you announced. I read it to you.
So I will explain to you what is happening.
Are they given interviews? Let's start with
because
that. Are they given interviews?
We were previously experiencing
That's starting to sound like a no. Well, let's just
90
hone in here. Mr.
almost-
Secretary, my time is very limited. I don't mean to interrupt you, but I want to drive to some clarity here.
But Senator,
The Texas Monthly has reported that once illegal immigrants go on their phone and reserve their time to come to the border, once they use your concierge service that you've created for them, when they come, they are given no interviews. They are asked no questions about any vulnerabilities. They are simply released into the country. Is that happening?
Senator, you are mistaken. And if I may explain,
Are they given interviews?
if I may explain, individuals who seek parole under our January 5th program for Cubans, Haitians, Nicaraguans, and Venezuelans are screened and vetted before they arrive at our border.
Wait a minute. No, they go on the phone and they just reserve a time, and then they show up and they're given nothing. Listen to this. Even immigration advocates are amazed about this. Here, also from the Texas Monthly. Here's one immigration advocate whose first name is Orta. She says, that's the crazy part. Nothing in this new program requires you to actually seek asylum. Somehow, we've decided to punish those who arrive at the border without the app, who may be seeking asylum, but we just let in anybody who may or may not have any particular reason to seek asylum, so long as they've made an appointment on your Ticketmaster app. This seems crazy to me.
Senator, it's a complete mischaracterization of the program that we announced and are implementing
So how many people have used the app then?
that you are referring to. So if I can explain.
How many people have used the app?
So we had a significant surge of Cubans.
How many people have used the app?
Nicaraguans and Venezuelans.
Mr. Secretary, you're here to answer my questions. How many people have used the app?
Tens of thousands have sought to make an appointment at the port of entry under our parole program.
Okay, good. How many have been admitted without an interview at the border?
You are, again, inserting a fact that does not belong in your question. So if I can, I will get you the precise.
I'm reading to you from public reports about how your own app works. You're just blanket denying. Actually, you're not quite denying it. You're saying that maybe we don't understand. Apparently, I don't understand. Texas Monthly doesn't understand. Immigration advocates don't understand. You're the only one who understands, yet you won't answer my question. How much did this cost to develop, by the way?
Senator, I don't have the cost, but let me share with you a critical
Well, will you
fact.
get it for us?
Let me share with you a critical
Will you
fact.
get us the cost of to develop this app?
Happily.
Did you contract with a tech firm to develop it?
Senator, we have seen a approximately.
Did you contract with a tech firm to develop it?
We have seen an approximately
for heaven's sake.
95% decrease.
Did you contract with a tech firm to develop it? Yes or no?
Senator, this was led by U.S. Customs and Border Protection, our technical experts within the agency, and I certainly will get an answer to your question whether outside consultants were utilized
So you don't
in the
know.
development process.
You don't know.
May I explain to you, since you have a misunderstanding of the program, what it is and the impact, the positive impact it has had on encounters of these four populations in between the
I just
ports of
want to know
entry.
why it is that you are allowing people to come to this border to make appointments, to not be interviewed, and then how many have just been released? Is it true, by the way, as the Texas Monthly reports, that they're simply released into the country on official parole? And get this, they're not given, according to their reporting, any kind of follow-up. Their court dates are in immigration courts, the Texas Monthly reports, not even necessarily asylum trials. They're often general deportation hearings where defendants can make arguments for remaining in the country. Is that true?
That is a completely mistaken understanding of how the immigration process works. That language is completely confusing and erroneous.
Well, it is confusing. What's confusing is why anybody would think that an app like this to allow illegal immigrants to literally reserve a time to come to the border and then be ushered in without an interview, without follow-up, without tracking is stunning. It's absolutely stunning. Let me ask you in my very short time remaining something else about Chinese nationals. I've only got a minute left.
That is false.
Let me ask you about the Chinese nationals who we all saw coming over the border, busloads of them, and then being released in the American interior. What's the percentage increase of Chinese nationals who crossed the border this year, Mr. Secretary? Let's just focus on maybe the Rio Grande Valley
The
segment.
number of Chinese nationals encountered at our southern border has increased significally.
Do you know how much?
Over the past, I don't have the precise
I
percentage.
do. It's 900% just in the Rio Grande Valley sector. Are any of these people who came in this bus, these Chinese nationals, members of the Chinese Communist Party?
Senator, if an individual presents a national security or public safety threat, we detain them during the pendency
That's
of
not that's not what I asked. I asked if they're members of the CCP.
during the pendency of their removal proceedings.
Are any of these individuals members of the CCP?
So
I think
if
there's about
indeed-
70 who came on this bus.
If indeed they are determined to be a national security threat or a threat to public safety, we detain them pending their removal proceedings.
Were any of these individuals detained, or were they released into the interior of the country?
I don't have awareness of that particular group of individuals.
And so you don't know if any of them were members of the CCP? Or actually, you do know, you just won't say.
I don't know from the photograph, Senator, to whom
But
you're
surely you
precisely
know about the folks who you've read this report, you're the Secretary of Homeland Security, you're aware of these individuals. Were any of them members of the Chinese Communist Party coming into this country?
Senator, you're providing me with a group of individuals without names, identities, or
So you're not
information.
familiar with this incident that was widely reported on at the southern border? Don't you think it's strange that we have busloads of Chinese nationals coming across our southern border? I'm asking you from a hostile country, I'm asking you if they're members of the Chinese Communist Party, and you don't know, apparently, you won't say.
We are very focused on all things with respect to the People's Republic of
But you
China.
don't know any of the details. I plead exhaustion, Mr. Secretary. You have exhausted me, you have exhausted this panel, you have exhausted the patience of the American people. You should resign.
Senator Welch?
Thank you very much. Welcome. Just a couple of things. First of all, a brief statement, and then I'd like to ask you about some of these questions, including give you an opportunity perhaps to elaborate on the question that Senator Hawley was asking. But first of all, Mr. Chairman, let me express the frustration I have about this whole issue. We conflate everything into one thing and never start talking specifically about the elements that we have to address. We've got a drug problem with fentanyl. That's separate from immigration, but some of it comes in on the border. And that's a serious conversation, in my view, that deserves its own focus. Second, we have a labor problem. We need more H-2A and H-2B visas. And I believe that could be dealt with and addressed separately to try to meet the needs that many of our employers have, and also to get some more control and management on the border. Third, we've got these young people who are not so young now, many of whom have served in the military, but they were brought over by their parents when they were 7 or 8 or 9 years old. We have one who's a graduate of UVM Medical School, and he has an uncertain status. And the only country he's ever really known is the United States, and he's a big contributor. We should be dealing with the Dreamers separately. And then fourth, we've got an incredible challenge at the southern border and an emerging challenge at the northern border. So whether you want to use the term crisis or not, it is a very serious problem. When 2 million people show up at your door, that's a problem because we don't have the capacity to accommodate that. And probably our toughest issue. Now, some of these issues are because Congress has failed to act. I think Senator Lee made some really good points about parole, but that's within our jurisdiction to define what that is. And if we do nothing, how can we blame an administration for trying to do something that makes sense to try to get some control over the border? So this is on Congress. And, you know, Senator Cruz, maybe I would use the term crisis at the border because 2 million people showing up, you know, that's a really serious problem. But it's not as though any individual who has Mr. Mayorkas' job, whether in the Trump administration or the Biden administration, can control a lot of what happens. And the thing that we're not acknowledging here is that if you have 2 million people showing up because of various factors that make them so desperate that they'll even come with their children, a war in Ukraine, a rogue rebel group showing up in Sierra Leone, chopping off hands of 16-year-old kids who then apply for refugee status, or failed states in Cuba, in Venezuela, in Nicaragua, and people being so desperate they're willing to risk walking through the Darien Gap. I mean, Secretary Mayorkas can't handle that, and I mean, you can't stop those factors. You have nothing to do with them. You've got to deal with the consequences of them. And my view is that each one of these elements that I've described has an urgency of its own and requires focused attention, including some of these legal questions that Senator Cruz you've raised and Senator Lee has raised. That's just by way of background to express my own frustration about what I see as a failure of Congress to do its part. Now, Secretary Mayorkas, I want to give you a chance to address the questions that Senator Hawley was raising, and just take a minute to do that.
So, thank you, Senator. So let me explain the program that we announced and have been implementing since January 5th, because it's been tremendously successful. We were encountering,
But quickly.
we were encountering a significant number of individuals from Cuba, Haiti, Nicaragua, and Venezuela. And with respect to Cuba, Nicaragua, and Venezuela specifically, it's extremely difficult to remove individuals from those countries because of the status of or lack of diplomatic relations. We were seeing in 1 month up to 90,000 encounters of individuals from those 4 countries in between our ports of entry in 1 month. And what we did, because we do see tremendous tragedy at the hands of the smuggling organizations, is develop a safe, lawful, and orderly way for them to come to the United States instead of placing their lives and their life savings in the hands of the smugglers.
Right, thank
We
you.
have seen a 95% drop in the number of individuals from those countries encountered at our southern border in between the ports of entry, because people will take a lawful, safe, and orderly path and not take an irregular path at the hands of smugglers.
Thank you. I want to go to fentanyl. Senator Cornyn led a CODEL to Mexico, and it was tremendous and constructive, and I want to thank him for that. Senator Lee was on that. There was an interaction with the president of Mexico, led by Chris Murphy and also by Jerry Moran, senators, who confronted the president about the precursor drugs that are coming into Mexico from China and then used in the manufacturing of fentanyl that comes up to the United States. And they asked and received. What I heard was a very strong commitment on the part of the president of Mexico to address China. We don't really have that opportunity, but to address China about stopping those precursors. That's a level of cooperation that we need more of. Would you agree?
Yes, indeed. And we've spoken as well with our Mexican counterparts about the need to interdict the precursor chemicals as well as the manufacturing equipment.
All right, and President Obrador had a real objection to all the guns that are coming from the U.S. into Mexico and then ending up in the hands of cartels that just commit unspeakable violence with them. Are we doing all we can to cooperate with the president to keep our guns from going south?
Yes, we are, Senator.
Now, you have authorities under Section 702 of FISA. Is that helpful at all to you with respect to addressing the fentanyl crisis?
It is extraordinarily helpful. We have, over the years, stopped terrorists from arriving in the United States using our 702 authority, our intelligence collection capabilities with respect to foreign nationals.
What are the concrete steps we can take to try to alleviate the pressure on the southern border that you would recommend that we pay more attention to?
I would say there are multiple. Number one, first and foremost, we have to fix our broken immigration system. Everyone agrees it is broken. Number two, we need to build safe, lawful, and orderly pathways so people do not place their lives in the hands of smugglers. We have to cut the smuggling organizations out, and we have to reduce irregular migration and build lawful pathways. Okay. And three, we have to address the root causes, what you spoke of at the very outset. Why do people leave their homes, their countries of origin, to travel through multiple countries to ultimately reach the United States or elsewhere? Because we're seeing enormous migration throughout the entire
In my
hemisphere.
final minute, let me ask you about the northern border. This is Vermont and New York as well. We're seeing a surge between October 1 and December 31, 2022. CPP apprehended 1,146 migrants crossing into the U.S. through the Swanton sector. That's up in northwest Vermont. During that same period in 2021, it was only 136 migrants. More are crossing from the United States into Canada at the northern border. What are we doing about the situation of migrants from the U.S. traveling to Canada and Canada to the U.S.?
So we're very focused on that, Senator, as I mentioned earlier in my testimony, and what we announced just last week is a perfect example of our focus. We we promulgated the Safe Third Country Agreement with Canada to bring greater enforcement authority to both our countries with respect to encounters in between the ports of entry.
Okay, thank you. And just before I yield back, I would just say to all of my colleagues, you know, we can have whoever happens to be the Secretary of Homeland Security, bring him in and beat him up. Or we can do our job. And my hope is we could do our job. I yield back.
Madam Chair.
I call on Senator Cotton for 10
I'd just like
minutes.
to offer by unanimous consent to admit two documents into the record. One is a news article dated March 22nd and bearing the caption, Biden administration scaling back detention of illegal immigrants despite migrant surge. The other is the ICE budget overview from FY 2024, showing what the Biden administration is doing to scale back funding for bed space and bed space. Thanks.
Without objection. Senator Cotton.
Secretary Mayorkas, the Uyghur people are a religious and ethnic minority in northwest China. Your administration and the last administration have both concluded that the Chinese government is committing genocide against this people. Do you agree with that assessment?
Yes, I do, and it's why we are so vigorously enforcing the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act.
Well, thank you for the candid answer on that. That's much better than, for instance, the TikTok CEO could give last week about the genocide against this people. Part of Congress's reaction, as you suggested, was in 2021 passing a bill that I and many others sponsored. In fact, I think it was a majority of senators, known as the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. It passed the Senate unanimously, so I know that you're familiar with it. The law requires Customs and Border Protection at DHS to presume that materials sourced from that province are produced by forced labor because of the widespread usage of forced labor in the province among this oppressed people. It bars those products from importation into the United States. And under that law, every textile manufacturer has to certify that their imported materials aren't sourced from Xinjiang province in China. It's come to my attention that a veteran-owned company called Nine Line Apparel, which prides itself on ethically sourced products, recently decided to trust but verify their suppliers' certifications that the cotton they were using originated in Central America rather than in China. So they had their supposedly clean textile imports professionally tested. It turned out that slave-produced fabric from China was mixed in and passed off as Central American cotton. Nine Line Apparel did the right thing, got rid of all that material, and they reported it to Customs and Border Protection, offering to give them all the evidence they needed from their professional testing facility. But unfortunately, CBP decided not to follow up. They directed Nine Line Apparel to submit a complaint to a generic email box, which was not replied to. When Nine Line Apparel CEO then followed up by calling CBP directly, CBP told him that enforcing this act's ban on slave-produced textiles and other fabric is not one of their top priorities. Mr. Secretary, is enforcing the federal ban on slave-produced products and materials from China a top priority for your department?
It most certainly is.
Why would CBP have told the CEO of Nine Line Apparel that this is not a top priority?
That is not a reflection of our prioritization of this work, nor is it consistent with our prioritization of this work. And I must say that the Act is an incredibly important statute that Congress passed, and I appreciate your leadership in achieving it. It is something that we enforce very, very vigorously and need to do so. And I should say that the Act provides that it pertains to materials produced in whole or in part with forced labor. And I cite that because that is very important language, because we do not countenance at all the use of forced labor by the PRC. And we cannot allow materials into the United States that are in violation of the statute.
Okay, thank you for that answer, Mr. Secretary. I think it's important that we heard that here in public for everyone in CBP to hear that their secretary believes that the enforcement of the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act is a top priority, correct?
Oh, yes, and let me assure you that the personnel of CBP are in perfect lockstep with me.
Well, I know that sometimes in bureaucracies, messages don't always get transmitted as clearly as leaders might like, so I'm glad that we have you saying that clearly today. I would also like to be able to follow up with you and your team in the next couple weeks about this specific case of Nine Line Apparel and see what might have happened in that matter.
I look forward to doing so.
Second, I want to turn to TikTok. We've had a lot of talk about fentanyl today, rightly so, given the surge in drug deaths in this country. TikTok has sometimes been referred to as digital fentanyl. You may have seen last week that the CEO of TikTok testified, and he tried to pass off this Chinese communist spying app as safe because it had a, quote, U.S.-based team who oversees the massive amounts of Americans' data that TikTok vacuums up. So I want to talk about those U.S.-based employees. Last year, your department approved more than 700 applications for foreign nationals to work at TikTok and ByteDance's offices in California. Do you happen to recall how many of those 700 were Chinese nationals?
Let me assure you, Senator, that we are very focused on the threat that TikTok presents, and we are very, very focused on the threat that the PRC presents.
So I'll come to that general threat in a moment. I'm just
number of different areas.
Do you recall how many of those 700 foreign nationals that were approved to work at TikTok and ByteDance's California offices were Chinese nationals?
Senator, I would be very pleased to look into that.
There's 445. It doesn't sound like a U.S.-based team to me, despite whatever Xiao Chu, the CEO of TikTok, said last week, if they're predominantly Chinese nationals. Do you think employees coming to work at ByteDance and TikTok in the United States might be tied to the Chinese Communist Party or the People's Liberation Army?
Senator, that is indeed a concern of ours, and we are working to ensure that the visa screening process is as robust and vigilant as it needs to be.
Okay,
Let me share also that, of course, the TikTok transaction is something that is under a review and is the subject of litigation. We are very, very focused on the peril that TikTok presents.
I understand. I think TikTok should have been banned a long time ago. I would point out that last week, as the administration floated this plan, so-called Project Texas, which I think is deeply misguided, and the sale of TikTok, China's government said they would never allow that to happen, which contradicts everything TikTok has ever said about not being beholden to the Chinese government. But I want to come back to your department. The Cybersecurity and Infrastructure Security Agency, or CISA, reports to you. They call themselves America's Cyber Defense Agency. I looked on their website recently. As far as I can tell, though, CISA has never issued a warning about TikTok other than to recommend people update the TikTok app to fix software bugs. I got to say, I'm less concerned about bugs in TikTok than I am about features in TikTok. And the features of TikTok is it's designed to vacuum up every bit of data on an American's phone, not just their videos from the app itself, but their contacts, their emails, their text messages, their photos, perhaps even activate their microphones and their cameras remotely. So has CISA ever issued a warning to the American people about TikTok other than updating the software to avoid bugs?
Senator, CISA's focus is indeed on cybersecurity. We are a member of the Committee for Foreign Investments in the United States, CFIUS, of which you are very familiar. And we, and across the administration, are focused on the TikTok challenge more broadly.
Well, I would encourage you and CISA to take a more or to take a closer look at this and make it more prominent on the website. I think many Americans still don't understand why so many of their elected officials are so hostile to TikTok. Even that hearing last week when Democrats and Republicans alike excoriated the disgraceful performance of Xiao Chu, this TikTok CEO, they're still wondering why their elected officials are still worried about their privacy and their security. Let's turn to Mr. Chu. Do you know what nationality Xiao Chu is?
I do not, Senator.
It's hard to find out on the internet what he is. He's often referred to as a Singaporean. He spent a lot of time in America, though, if you look at his resume. I assume that he's not an American citizen, because if he was, I'm pretty sure TikTok would refer to him as our American CEO, as they did his short-term predecessor.
Senator, just a number of months ago, I was in Singapore, and to address in the Indo-Pacific region the threat that the PRC presents. When countries accept their loans, there's no free lunch, as I articulated in my remarks, and how precarious it is to allow the PRC to actually build and own the infrastructure upon which many of these countries rely.
Well, I appreciate that. I just want to have a few concluding thoughts with Mr. Chu, who seems to me like a Communist Party stooge, an agent of communist influence in America. You know, he wouldn't admit what you admitted very quickly and highlighted the importance of, that China is committing a genocide against its own people. In fact, I think he was asked once if TikTok spies on Americans, and his answer was that, well, he wouldn't use the word spying as exactly the right word. So the Immigration and Nationality Act makes any alien deportable if they, quote, engage in any activity to violate any law of the United States relating to espionage or sabotage or a few other things. Seems to me that Mr. Chu is a foreign national in the United States representing essentially an arm or an agency of the Chinese Communist Party, as they acknowledged last week. He shouldn't be allowed to stay in the United States, and he certainly shouldn't be invited back in. I don't think we need agents of Chinese communist influence in our country, especially coming to spread their lies in the United States Congress. See, my time has expired. I look forward to following up with you on the Forced Labor Act matter, and thank you for clarifying that for all of your CBP officers around the country.
Thank you, Senator.
I call on myself for 10 minutes. Welcome, Mr. Secretary. I would ask for unanimous consent to enter into the record an opinion piece by two governors, Eric Holcomb, Republican governor of Indiana, Spencer Cox, Republican governor of Utah, and it is an opinion piece for the Washington Post entitled "To Solve Our National Immigration Crisis, Let States Sponsor Immigrants." They call upon Congress to end the two-decade-long impasse regarding comprehensive immigration reform, and they note that we are a nation of immigrants. And I know that, Mr. Secretary, you are a political refugee, and since you came to our country seeking a better life, your parents and you, which is why most immigrants come to this country, you have spent decades as a federal prosecutor and a public servant in the United States, and I thank you for that. And of course, as the only immigrant serving in the U.S. Senate right now, I certainly understand the desire to come to, parental desire to come to this country to create a better life for themselves and their children. Certainly the case for me, and it informs what I do and why I do it. The Trump administration completed 472 executive actions related to immigration policy, many of which were punitive and cruel. In fact, there were people who said that cruelty was the intent of these policies. And who can forget the pictures of children who literally were ripped from the arms of their parents, crying for their parents in our detention facilities. And only when a court ordered reunification did the Trump administration then try to reunify these children. And it was difficult because the administration had absolutely no desire or goal to reunify these children with their parents, so they didn't keep track of the children and their parents. So these were inhumane policies, and I heard today that maybe if we reverted to those policies, that we would be solving our immigration problems. Mr. Secretary, would reverting to cruel and inhumane policies like child separation or an asylum ban be the answer?
Senator, I appreciate your remarks about why people come to this country for a better life. I appreciate your mention of my personal journey to this United States. My parents brought my sister and me here to live in a democracy. The communist regime took everything away that my father had, and it is why I have served for approximately 22 years in federal service on behalf of the United States government to give back to this country. Senator, there's a core principle of our administration. We are a nation of laws, and we are a nation of immigrants, and how we enforce our laws and the policies that we promulgate, the policies that we issue, must reflect our values. And you cite one of the most heinous policies of the prior administration, family separation, to remove young children out of the clutches of their parents in an effort to deter other individuals from coming to the United States and assert an asylum claim. I'm very proud to lead the Family Reunification Task Force that the President ordered by way of executive action, and we have reunited more than 600 of those children with their parents here in the United States. And our work is not done.
And certainly going back to those policies are not the answer. In fact, let me turn to a program that I think is better positioned to address some of the issues relating to immigration. In 2016, DHS implemented a detention alternative, the Family Case Management Program, initially for 5 years. The Trump DHS shut it down after only 1.5 years. But the data showed that this more humane program was also more cost-effective than detention, and it has an amazing compliance rate with more than 99% appearance rates at check-ins and court hearings. I understand that DHS has relaunched a program to provide case management services to some immigrants. Given the success of the Family Case Management Program, do you expect to see similar results with the new program?
Yes, I do, Senator. And in fact, we've done more than that. Just recently, I asked the Homeland Security Advisory Council, an outside body, to take a look at our alternatives to detention programs, including the case management pilot to which you refer, and to provide recommendations about what are the most humane as well as effective programs to ensure that people can comply with their legal obligations in a very, very complex immigration system that everyone agrees is fundamentally broken and in dire need of repair, and that's been the case for decades.
I think I'm really glad that you continue to emphasize the humane policies that we should be following rather than policies where cruelty seemed to be the object of the policy. Certainly, the tearing of children from the arms of their parents cannot be characterized as anything but cruel. I mentioned the op-ed that the two governors, Republican governors, wrote, and they are facing literally over 100,000 worker shortages in both of their states. And we are facing a severe worker shortage in our country. And I want to quote the Chamber of Commerce, maybe the first time that I would quote Chamber of Commerce. And they said, quote, "The vast shortcomings of our legal immigration system are a key contributing factor as to why companies are struggling to hire and retain the talent they need to succeed in an increasingly competitive global marketplace," end quote. Mr. Secretary, is the worker shortage, especially in cybersecurity, for example, a security threat? And whose job is it to fix our legal immigration system?
So, Senator, it is an economic security threat. The shortage of workers. We have employers who are striving to find people who could fill jobs to contribute to our country's economic prosperity. Regrettably, our legal immigration system is not designed to meet that need of employers here in the United States, despite the fact that individuals from other countries want to come here to work, even seasonally, even temporarily, earn the money that they can bring back to their home countries and support their families there. It is precisely why in the H-2B program, the seasonal non-agricultural worker program, we allocated thousands of H-2B visas for the Central American countries of Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador, so that those individuals in desperate need of a better life do not have to place their lives in the hands of smugglers, take the perilous journey to our southern border, and arrive in between the ports of entry, if indeed they make it safely, but instead to fulfill the need for labor here in the United States, we can screen and vet these individuals in their home countries, and they can travel safely to the United States by air, gain lawful employment, contribute to our economy, return to their home countries with the earnings that they've made, and address fundamentally the root causes of why people travel irregularly in the first place. We just cannot seem to fix a system that everyone agrees is broken.
Mr. Secretary, you and I, as immigrants, we know why our families brought us to this country. It is to give us a better life. I came here with nothing and a single parent. And I just wish that my colleagues who talk about their own families and their grandparents, their parents being immigrants, they seem to have forgotten the struggles that they experienced to make a better life for them, and here we all are. You know, there was a time not too long ago in 2013 when we managed to get comprehensive immigration reform done. It didn't solve all of the crises that we face, but it was at least a start, and it was actually bipartisan. Some of my colleagues sitting here were very involved in doing that, and I'm thinking, why does the Chamber of Commerce have to come forward and practically beg us to pay attention to the massive worker shortage in our country? Why do two Republican governors don't want to wait around any longer for Congress, whose responsibility, I'm answering my own question now, whose responsibility it is to do comprehensive immigration reform? These two governors, Republican governors, saying, we can't wait for you guys. We would like to be able to bring immigrants to our state so that they can have the kind of strong economy that they seek for their states. So my goodness, why can't we get it done? We did it before. My time is up. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
I liked your testimony so much I didn't want to interrupt you, but thank you, Senator Hirono. Senator Kennedy?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Mr. Secretary.
Thank you, Senator.
Mr. Secretary, do you agree with the President that we should ban the private ownership of assault weapons in America?
Senator, I do.
What is an assault weapon?
It is, for example, an AK-47.
Can you give me a definition other than just pointing to a specific weapon? Would there be other weapons besides an AK-47 you would ban?
There very well are. And I remember when I was a federal prosecutor in the Central District of California from September 25th, 1989 to, I believe it was April 2001.
And I thank you for your service, but if you could answer my question.
The vast majority of law enforcement officers, leaders with whom I worked were greatly in support of the assault weapons ban.
Mr. Chairman, you know why we get so frustrated with you? Because you won't give straight answers.
I think I just did.
No, you didn't. No, you didn't. Do you have a definition of an assault weapon?
I am confident there is a technical definition of what is an assault weapon, and it was assuredly used in the context of the statute that previously existed banning assault weapons.
Mr. Secretary, our southern border is not secure, is it?
Senator, I have spoken about this. I believe I've addressed this earlier in the hearing.
Why don't you address it again?
Of course. Let me share with you a few things. Number one, when I speak of the security of the border, I am speaking of maximizing the resources we have to deliver the most effective results.
So
and let me assure you that we are doing
it's secure
so.
because we're trying to secure it. Are we succeeding?
Senator, we are so focused on the security of our southern border. We are doing so much with respect to the surge of personnel.
How you're not succeeding?
Oh, Senator, let me share with you that the challenge of migration that we are experiencing at our southern border is not exclusive to the United States. It is something that is gripping the entire hemisphere.
But my job is to worry about the United States,
as is mine. As is mine.
And here's my question. Let me try to rephrase it. And I really do wish, I understand the position you're in, but you really should try to do a better job of answering the questions. Under the Biden administration, we have the most encounters. We have had the most encounters with people attempting to come into our country illegally in the history of ever. Under the Biden administration, we have had the most people entering our country illegally in the history of ever. Under the Biden administration, we have had the most gotaways at our southern border in the history of ever. Under the Biden administration, we have had the most number of people entering our country under a claim of asylum, having that claim turned down and still not being deported in the history of ever. And under the Biden administration, we've had the most fentanyl coming into our country in the history of ever. How can you possibly say the southern border is secure?
Do you know
I understand your answer that you're trying, but I'm not asking about your efforts. I'm asking about the results.
Well, let's talk about the results then, Senator. Do you know that last year we expelled and removed approximately 1.4 million people from the southern border? I believe that's the most ever. Do you realize that we are focused on enforcing our laws to achieve the security of the southern border?
I know you're focused, Mr. Chairman, or Mr. Secretary, but you're not succeeding.
Senator,
and when you come testify to us, you talk about how you're trying really hard. And I don't have any way to disprove that. I accept that statement in good faith. but the numbers belie that.
If I can, Senator, let me give you an example of a solution that we have delivered that for some reason is being contested. Because it's
Mr.
caused the
Secretary,
95.
I give you 30 seconds, okay?
It's caused the 95.
Don't filibuster me.
It's
You've
caused.
been doing that all day. I'm just trying to ask
I'm just
you
trying to
questions.
communicate. It has led to a approximately 95% drop in the number of encounters in between the ports of entry at our southern border of Cubans, Haitians, Nicaraguans, and Venezuelans
Mr. Secretary,
on January 5th.
Mr.
And why would that
Secretary.
be opposed when it is delivering precisely the result that you seek?
Did you just parachute in from another planet, Mr. Secretary? Because you're the only person in the Milky Way who believes that we're not having massive illegal immigration into America.
Senator, you're putting words into my mouth.
No, sir,
There is-
I'm
there is-
accurately describing the
There is
situation.
no question. There is no question that we have a very serious challenge at our southern border.
Okay,
It
let
is
me-
a
let me-
challenge.
Well,
that is
we can agree on that. Let me ask you another question. Why don't you just declare a new policy that other than children, if you present at the southern border, you claim refugee status, you claim political asylum, and you haven't claimed refugee status and political asylum at the first safe country and you can't come in.
Senator, so first of all, when one presents at the border, it's an asylum claim, not
But
a
why
refugee.
don't you do that? Why don't
Not
you
a
just
refugee claim.
unilaterally declare that it, safe third country policy? It would work. You can't come into America. If you're coming from Venezuela and you come through Mexico, if you didn't claim asylum in Mexico, you can't come here. You have to leave. Why don't you just do that?
Well, Senator, let me give you an example with respect to Mexico. A safe third country agreement, let's hypothetically
you
assume.
don't have to have an agreement with Mexico.
Yes, you do.
No, you don't.
I believe you do,
No,
Senator.
you don't.
I'll have
Other
to-
countries don't do it. Just adopt a policy that says, except for children, because you don't want to send children back by themselves. Just adopt a new policy that if you didn't seek asylum in the first safe third country, you can't come in, period.
Senator, are you aware of the notice of proposed rulemaking that we issued, the comment period of which closed yesterday?
You've had 2 years to adopt a policy like I just described. Why haven't you done it?
So, Senator, what we have done is
But why haven't you done that?
we have surged enforcement resources. We have
Why haven't
developed.
you just adopted, please, if you would, Mr. Secretary, answer my question.
It is my understanding.
Why haven't you adopted unilaterally a safe third country policy? That would stop, except for children, all the folks from the Northern Triangle countries, all the folks from Venezuela, all the folks from Cuba, all the folks from the Middle East from coming into our country. Why haven't you done that?
Senator, it's my understanding that those are two things. It is my understanding that those agreements do require
You don't have to have an agreement with anybody. It can be a policy established by the Department of Homeland Security.
Senator, I'd have to review the.
You haven't reviewed that? You haven't considered that possibility?
Let me finish, if I may.
Sure.
I would have to review the legal underpinnings of your
Well, you
assertion.
better get reviewing.
And I also
You ought to
do
get
not-
reviewing. This is the first time that's occurred to you.
I also do not think that that is sound policy.
You don't
to
think
shut-
this is the first time that's occurred to you?
I also do not think that that is sound policy, that we should shut down our entire asylum system.
I didn't say shut down the entire asylum system. I said safe third country. All you have to do, Mr. Secretary, if you're really serious, and it's beginning, frankly, to appear that you're not, is adopt a policy that says We're not seeking anyone's agreement. We don't have to. If you're coming from another country and you come through, let's say Mexico, and you say you're seeking asylum, you have to seek it in Mexico or the other first safe third country, or you can't come in. Period. Done. End of story. Why don't you do that?
Senator, I don't think that we have the unilateral authority.
Sure you do. Other countries
Number one
do
and
it.
number two, as
If
I've
you
mentioned,
try sneaking into China,
as I've mentioned, I do not think that is sound policy.
why?
Because you are basically shutting down our asylum system.
No,
and
you're
really-
not. You're saying we honor your right to seek political asylum, but you're cherry picking. Do it in Mexico first. Why haven't you done that?
I think I've addressed that issue, Senator.
You don't want to do it, Mr. Secretary. That's what it's beginning to look like, because you think our borders ought to be open. And it would be more intellectually honest if you just say that.
That is false.
I don't agree with you. You have to watch up here what people do, not what they say, and everything else is just cottage cheese.
Senator, I don't think
Thank you,
I don't
Mr.
think
Chairman.
that 1.4 million people who were expelled or removed last year would consider the border open.
Mr. Chairman, Mr. Secretary, you've had millions coming into the country illegally. The most of the history of ever under your watch. And everybody knows that, apparently, except you. Either that or you're not being forthcoming with it.
We've also had the largest number of individuals expelled or removed from the southern border. And if one takes a look at the apprehension and encounter numbers, and then the removal numbers, one would have a different view.
If you do the safe third country policy, that'll solve half of your problem right there.
Thank
And
you,
you're
Senator.
not denying anybody asylum.
Thank you, Senator Kennedy. Senator Ossoff.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Welcome, Secretary Mayorkas. I'd like to discuss with you the H-2A visa program, whereby, as you know, agricultural workers can pursue a visa legally to work in the United States to support the production of food in our country. And this is a program, of course, that's extensively utilized by our agricultural sector, important for our food security. But last year, a federal investigation called Operation Blooming Onion uncovered that some farm workers who were in the country through the H-2A visa program legally to work had been subjected to human rights abuses and labor conditions so severe and inhumane that the Department of Justice deemed them to constitute modern-day slavery. So I sent you a letter on March 1st, 2022 to ask you to reform the administration of this program to ensure that farm workers legally with an H-2A visa entering the United States would not be subjected to such appalling and inhumane treatment. And you responded, and I appreciate your response, just a couple of months later, and informed me that you would in fact undertake such reform and that you'd begun a rulemaking process to do so. So I'd like to ask you for an update, please, on that rulemaking process and on the department's efforts to ensure that workers in the United States through the H-2A visa program are not subjected to these crimes and this catastrophic treatment.
Senator, thank you very much. So two things. Number one, the rulemaking is underway, I believe, and number two, and I can provide you with a more specific update after this hearing. But critically, or I should say, and critically, we have revised our worksite enforcement strategy for precisely the reason that you identify, precisely because of what we observed in Operation Blooming Onion and tragically in other circumstances as well. Our enforcement resources in the worksite environment are focused on investigating and prosecuting employers who exploit the vulnerability of the migrant workforce by paying them substandard wages, by keeping them in substandard working conditions, not only exploiting the vulnerable workers themselves, but also creating an unfair advantage in the marketplace, because through those conditions, through the imposition of those conditions, they charge lower prices and create an unfair competitive advantage. So it is unscrupulous employers upon whom we are bringing to bear our worksite enforcement authorities.
Will you please provide my office with an update? Will your staff please provide my office with an update by the end of this week on the expected date for completion of this initial rulemaking process?
Yes, and I should say that the worksite enforcement strategy that we announced several months ago is already underway. It does not require rulemaking. It is a matter of using our enforcement authorities and resources most effectively, and that is how we are doing so.
Understood. Continuing the discussion about the H-2A program and considering in particular the small and medium-sized farmers and growers who utilize it, recognizing that the various elements within DHS have significant resource constraints and a lot of work to do, including ensuring the fair and humane treatment of workers under this program. DHS has proposed dramatically increasing the application fees charged by USCIS for a variety of visa programs, including for H-2A and H-2B petitions, whereby employers could see increases of up to 250% in a single year. And of course, we're in an environment where farmers are facing high fuel prices, high fertilizer prices, and where Americans are facing high grocery prices. So my question for you is, in developing this proposed rule and the increase in fees for USCIS for H-2A and H-2B programs, have you consulted the Department of Agriculture? And is there some accommodation that can be made to ensure that there are not crippling fees imposed upon small and medium-sized farmers who are having a tough time right now?
So, Senator, if I may, so the fee rule to which you refer is an effort to try to get U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services back on stable financial footing. A fee rule, the adjustment of costs for immigration benefits, is supposed to be revised every 2 years. A fee rule has not issued for more than 6 years. So that agency was decimated in the prior administration, and the reason for the proposed significant increases in certain costs for certain benefits is by reason of that fact and the need to actually infuse much needed funding for that agency. It is not a rule that we promulgate unilaterally, but rather it is in the proposed rulemaking stage. We are receiving comments in response to it, and no final decisions have been made.
Good. Well, I want to urge you to consider the economic circumstances of those small and medium-sized farmers in particular, with such a sudden increase in the fees they rely upon, the fees for the visa services that they rely upon. Let me ask you about DHS detention practices. As you know, I led an investigation in the Permanent Subcommittee of Investigations last year, whose findings were deeply disturbing, indeed horrifying. This bipartisan investigation I led with Senator Johnson of Wisconsin found that female detainees in DHS custody detention in Georgia were subjected by a DHS-contracted doctor to excessive, invasive, and often unnecessary gynecological surgical procedures, including, in some cases, without informed consent. In November of last year, during a Homeland Security Committee hearing, you committed to me to review the findings of that investigation. We made a number of recommendations in our report accompanying that investigation, expediting and improving vetting of off-site medical providers, and dramatically strengthening the procedures by which you ensure that DHS detainees have the opportunity to consent or not to medical services. What steps have you taken since that investigation?
So, Senator, thank you very much for the report that you and Senator Johnson led. I did indeed review that report. As I think you know, we closed the facility that was the subject of that investigation. I did direct that the recommendations be reviewed and implemented to the fullest extent possible, and I'd be very pleased to get you an updated report of the status of that implementation.
Well, I think that's urgent, and I want to get that information as soon as possible. We're talking about women convicted of no crime in the custody of the U.S. government being subjected to gynecological surgical procedures that were not medically indicated, often without informed consent. It's one of the, and I do want to state for the record that this appalling activity occurred prior to your tenure, so there's no mistaking for the public tuned in here right now, but it is completely unacceptable that practices may persist that leave women in detention at risk of this treatment, and I'm sure you agree with me, Mr. Secretary. I want an update on what you're doing to address it. And finally, I want to talk to you about your Office of Intelligence and Analysis.
Yes, and we are addressing that with due urgency because of precisely how appalling that conduct was and what was going on in that facility. We closed that facility.
I know you did, and I want to make sure that there are practices being implemented across DHS detention facilities to ensure that can never, ever happen again. So I look forward to that update. I want to ask you about your Intelligence and Analysis Office. There has been recent reporting about problems at the DHS Office of Intelligence and Analysis. I don't think that the Congress has sufficient visibility into its activities. Among the conduct alleged in this public reporting, with respect to domestic intelligence gathering by the Office of Intelligence and Analysis, interviews with individuals in detention centers, local jails, and federal prisons without counsel present. That was one of the allegations made in public reporting. This is deeply troubling, and I don't think that there is very intense congressional oversight of this office. Is there a problem? What are you doing to address and identify the problem? And what does the Congress need to know?
So, Senator, the Office of Intelligence and Analysis is led by a phenomenal public servant in Ken Weinstein. He's the Undersecretary. He has a tremendous experience. He was the Homeland Security Advisor to former President Bush. When you speak of the interviews of individuals in custody who are in the pending legal proceedings, he suspended that practice. It was a practice that was implemented first in the prior administration. He suspended that practice, and he is really doing a phenomenal job in ensuring that the practices of INA, the Office of Intelligence and Analysis, adhere to our laws as well as to our fundamental principles of protecting the civil rights and civil liberties as well as the privacy.
Were there interviews of U.S.
all
persons?
individuals.
Were there interviews of U.S. persons in federal prisons or local or state jails without counsel present by INA personnel?
I believe that there were, and that was not necessarily always improper, but the practice was suspended because of concerns with respect to it. But I must say, Senator, that the personnel of the Office of Intelligence and Analysis are incredibly dedicated and incredibly principled in the execution of their responsibilities.
Thank you, Mr. Secretary.
Thank you, Senator Ossoff. Senator Blackburn.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Before I begin my questions today, I do want to express my heartbreak at what happened yesterday in Nashville at Covenant School and Covenant Presbyterian Church. And my family and I are grieving along with the rest of the community. And I thank you, Mr. Secretary, for your call yesterday, your kind remarks today. And violence against children is just one of the most heinous crimes. And the families there at Covenant Pres and Covenant School, I just grieve for what they're going through. We have to work to protect children at school, and that means increasing security. And I have had legislation that would allow for training and hiring of veterans and former law enforcement officials to serve as school safety officers and to help protect our schools. It is time for us to pass that and to help keep our children safe. I'd like to turn to the questions that are in front of us today. Mr. Secretary, thank you for your patience today. I want to go to this issue of human smuggling. And under this administration, the human smuggling business has gone from being a $500 million a year business to a $13 billion a year industry. And we heard from Secretary Becerra last week at our Senate Finance Committee. And we've got 85,000 unaccompanied alien children, migrant children, who have been released in the U.S. The HHS has lost track of these unaccompanied children. So my question to you is this: how many of these children are being trafficked? How many of these children are being put into the sex trade? What are you doing to try to find these children? And when you look at what is happening to women and children, do you all understand that it is the policies of this administration, what you're doing on the border, that is causing 85,000 children to be lost, can't find them, and not knowing if they're being trafficked, put in gangs, put in the sex trade? So what are you all doing to find these children, and do you understand that it is the policies that is causing this?
Senator, let me share with you what we are doing to address the scourge of human smuggling and human trafficking. And let me say, with respect to the unaccompanied children, and this will echo what I shared with Senator Ossoff just a moment ago. With respect to unaccompanied children, when we receive them at the border, it is our legal obligation to release them to the care of the Department of Health and Human Services within
That's right, and now they cannot find them.
within 72
85,000.
hours. And so what we do is we release
Is that
them.
an acceptable number?
Oh, absolutely not.
Right.
Absolutely not.
So
But-
what-
So let me share with you. So we release them. One of the reasons why we are devoting our worksite enforcement resources and energies on unscrupulous employers is precisely for the reason that you identify. We must hold accountable employers who engage in
Okay,
child labor.
I appreciate that. Let's look
With
at
respect,
it.
with
Yeah.
respect to the border,
Yeah, and
we-
let's look at it this way.
two efforts we have underway. One is we are taking it to the smugglers in an unprecedented
They haven't
effort.
gotten that message.
Oh, yes, they have. We have.
I beg to differ, because the situation, it is now a $13 billion a year business. When you go to that border, as I have done, and when you talk to women that have been trafficked and have gotten themselves out and have been raped repeatedly, there is a sexual assault epidemic going on that border. And it is because of the policies of this administration.
Senator.
And it is so.
Senator, it is because of the heinous exploitation of the smuggling organizations.
And what is
that do not
incentivizing
care,
that?
That do not
That's
care.
right. That's exactly right. And you and I agree on that. They do not care about human life. They see people as a product.
Yes, they are.
And a way to make a buck, because they are billion-dollar businesses. They have, and let me turn to the fentanyl epidemic, because we've all talked about this. And I'm hearing from some of my sheriffs now that from a border town sheriff, that fentanyl, a pill now is down to about 5 cents, because they've teamed up with the Chinese scientists. They're making these in the labs with the cartels. And I think that you've talked a little bit about the fentanyl today, but you really don't have an estimate of how much is truly coming over that border. And we know that you're saying that they are catching about 95% of that. But what I have heard is what you're giving us is the CBP numbers. You're not giving us the numbers that are coming from air and marine operations. You're not including the Coast Guard. You're not including the DEA, and you're not including what is found by state and local law enforcement. So why won't you look at the holistic number of what everybody is finding?
Oh, Senator, the scourge of fentanyl is something that we do not in any way underestimate. Let me, if I may, share with you. As I mentioned earlier, I served as a federal prosecutor for 12 years.
Yes.
I prosecuted
No,
cocaine.
you're not answering my
Oh, no, if
question,
I
and I've
can.
only got 3 minutes left.
If I can.
Why are you not, why do you not include what everybody is finding? State and local law
we do.
enforcement, the
But the-
DEA, the Marine?
We do. Senator, the question that was posed to me was with respect to the southern border and how fentanyl is trafficked into the United States.
Okay, I
And
need
the
to
vast
move
majority
on,
of
but
it-
if you will.
Vast majority of it is brought in through the ports of entry.
No, sir, I beg to differ with that. When you talk to Border Patrol and you talk to local sheriffs, I would like to get from you in writing a total number of what you are finding, not only from CBP, but also from the air and marine operations, the Coast Guard, the DEA, and state and local law enforcement. Let me move on about the gotaways, because we've had over 1.2 million migrants that have evaded authorities and have come into the country illegally. And it is of concern to me when I hear you all try to make illegal legal. There's an app for this, and allowing people to continue to come in illegally. Now, ICE arrested 220 illegal immigrants in 9 days that had criminal convictions of rape and murder. Now, it doesn't take rocket science to go figure out that in those 1.2 million that are unknown gotaways or known gotaways, that number that have disappeared in our country, that you've got murderers and criminals and rapists that are in that number, the gotaways. So how many of those have made it into Tennessee? How many are in our communities? How many are in our streets? Are you all tracking these, or have you lost them like the 85,000 children?
Senator, I would say two things. Number one, we are intensely focused on securing the border, as I have testified earlier. Number
Okay,
one.
then-
And number two, I think it's very important not to paint with a broad brush individuals who come to the United States.
Well, I
And
think it's
so-
important to note what Border Patrol is telling us. If you're intent on securing the border, then you spend $50 million a year to caretake the items, components from the border wall project that was in the previous administration. The border wall, by the way, the Border Patrol has been asking for a physical barrier for decades. I think about 30 years in total. So instead of wasting that money to do nothing with the construction material, why don't you use those remaining materials and that $50 million and fill in the gaps in this wall so that the Border Patrol has a physical barrier that they need?
Senator, I've approved the vast majority of the projects to close the gaps and complete the gates with respect to the funding that we received.
Mr. Chairman, I have one other question on Chinese nationals that I will submit for a written answer. Thank you.
Thank you, Senator Blackburn. Senator Tillis.
Good afternoon, Secretary Mayorkas. How's your day going?
Good afternoon, Senator.
I think I'm going to be the last one to speak. I want to start just by thanking Senator Ossoff. I've been working with him on the H-2A issues. I think that it's a struggle every year with just the execution of that program. And I am a bit concerned, I'm not going to ask you to respond, a bit concerned with casting the users of the H-2A program as, I don't think you meant it, but I could have inferred that they're all bad actors. Speaking for North Carolina, I think housing, workplace safety, compensation is competitive and done appropriately. So I hope as you go about any kind of change